Hello and welcome to Moon Day 2020. I'm Bruce Bleakley. I'm a volunteer here at the Frontiers of Flight Museum, and I'm standing in front of the Apollo Service Propulsion System engine that's hanging in the museum's new spaceflight gallery. It's my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce the keynote speaker for this virtual edition of Moon Day. Dr. Bernard Harris, Jr. was the first African American to walk in space. A veteran of 2 Space Shuttle missions, Dr. Harris logged 438 hours in space while traveling over 7 million miles. As a medical doctor, his extensive research in musculoskeletal physiology and clinical investigations of space adaptation have enabled him to develop countermeasures for extended duration spaceflight. After completing his residency in 1985 at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Harris completed a National Research Council fellowship at NASA Ames Research Center. He then joined NASA Johnson Space Center in 1987 as a clinical scientist and flight surgeon. Dr. Harris was a mission specialist in STS-55 in 1993 and was the payload commander for STS-63 in 1995, conducting a variety of research experiments in physical and life sciences. He is currently Chief Executive Officer of the National Math and Science Initiative here in Dallas and is the recipient of numerous awards in academia, medicine, and spaceflight. We are proud to present Dr. Bernard Harris as our keynote speaker for Moon Day 2020.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bernard Harris. I'm CEO of the National Math and Science Initiative and also a 2-time flyer of the Space Shuttle. And I'd like to thank the Frontiers of Flight Museum for inviting me to speak today. It was Moon Day in 1969, which was a very special day for me when I watched Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin land on the moon. And I knew from that day forth that I wanted to be an astronaut. So as you go through this museum today and listen to my upcoming presentation, I hope that you'll reflect on the achievements that we have made in this nation. And I hope it will be inspirational to you. So enjoy.
Let me start in 1969, going way back, when this guy that's addressing you this afternoon was 13 years old, watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin land on the moon. And when I saw that, I was fascinated with this notion that human beings could leave this planet and go to another heavenly body, the moon, and do it successfully, not just once, but several times. And as a kid, I was enamored with science, but particularly enamored with space science. And that's what sent me on the road to becoming an astronaut. As you heard in my introduction, I did a lot of education. Part of that included medicine. Part of that included working as a researching and developing medical equipment for space flight to ensure a long-term survival of human beings. And as a consequence, that gave me the background that I needed in order to apply. When you apply to the astronaut program, you come in and do 2 years of basic training, and where you learn how to fly jets and the space shuttle, and you take just a whole myriad of courses that prepare you for dealing with things here on Earth, but more importantly, in space and perhaps even on another planet. The slide that I'm showing you here is a picture of my second mission, which was a night liftoff. Beautiful. And this is the Space Shuttle Discovery. You have seen these vehicles lift off many times before, but you may not know that the vehicles weigh 5 million pounds. And in order to get that 5 million pounds in the air, we have to light 5 engines that produce a thrust of 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And I'm here to tell you this afternoon that when those engines light, you are leaving the planet in a hurry. How fast? Well, I could continue to describe that, but let me see if I can get the next slide of this to play. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5,
Liftoff. We have liftoff. Houston now controlling. Houston shuttle, roll program. Roger, roll maneuver. Already 7 miles away from the Kennedy Space Center at an altitude of 5 miles.
So I wanted to give you a feel of that liftoff, at least on my screen, it's
Shuttle
a
roll
little
maneuver
jerky.
is complete. The orbiter
But
is
what
in
you're
a
looking
heads
at
down
is
position.
first
All
stage.
systems in good
The
shape.
first stage is where we light the main engines, and they light the main engines consist of the solid rocket motors, which produces the most thrust, about 6.5 million pounds of thrust. And that gets you to a speed of 2,500 miles an hour within 2 minutes and an altitude over 100,000 feet above the Earth. And now you're above most of the atmosphere. So the only thing left to do is to speed up to get into orbital velocity. And over the course of the next 6.5 minutes, we go from 2,500 miles an hour to 5,000, 10,000, and eventually to 17,000 miles per hour. And at 17,000 miles per hour, we go from being pushed back in our seat to 3.5 times our weight. I weigh 210 pounds. You do the math, 3.5 times the 210 pounds, and you get to a lot of weight, a lot of pressure on the body. And after that whole time of 8.5 minutes, you go from that pressure to zero gravity in just a split second. And then things around you begin to float, and you realize that you are safely in orbit. This slide is the first view that I had of the Earth as I got out of my seat and floated up to the window to look out. And you might notice something that's a little different. The tail of the vehicle is actually upside down to the Earth. And that's typically how we orbit the Earth, with the vehicle being upside down. That's where our windows are. And so when you're in space, you don't want to be looking into deep space all the time. So you flip around so that you can have beautiful views of Mother Earth. Let me share with you our crew here. So the left part of your slide shows our crew on the ground as we're doing our typical publicity photo op, showing you the two types of suits that we wear. One being our launch and entry suits, which are down below. They are orange, and they are partial pressure suits that we use to go from Earth into space and from space back down to Earth. And then the suits at the top that you see that I am in is our EVA suit, or extravehicular activity suit. And that suit weighs about 350 pounds. And of course, I would not be able to wear that suit here on Earth if it were not for two technicians holding me up in the back and two holding my colleague up in the back against gravity. So if you can imagine that, but of course they're out of the view of the camera. The slide on the right is the same crew on orbit. And as I'm talking, I'd like you to kind of go back and forth on these photos. And I want to point out a few things. If you look at me, you'll notice that my face is a little puffier in space than it is on Earth. And that's called a fluid shift. As we sit here on Earth, about 1/5 of our blood volume is held down in our lower extremities. And when we go into orbit with zero gravity, that extra fluid within our vasculature moves up toward the head, and that extra fluid gets in the tissues of our face and makes our faces puffy. So you'll notice all of us on orbit, our eyes are actually smaller, again, from the puffiness in our face and around our eyes. Look at on the left side, the young lady that's right below me, and with the short hair, and that's Eileen Collins. Eileen Collins is a very special friend of mine. She's in my astronaut class. She also was the first female pilot and commander of a space shuttle mission. I'm really proud of her. But notice what happens to her hair as we go from on Earth into space. She gets an instant afro. And she wanted to make sure that this didn't happen. So she cut her hair. So not all astronauts cut their hair. Not all female astronauts cut their hair, and particularly not this one. This is Ivans, astronaut Ivans, who is noted for growing her hair extremely long. And the first thing she does when she gets on orbit is takes it out of the bun underneath the the space helmet and just let it flow. But it shows you what happens when you're on orbit to just simple things like your hair. So I served various roles when I was up in space. I served as the medical doctor. So here I am, examining one of my crew members. I also served on my second mission as the payload commander, where I was in charge of all the experiments that were carried out on the mission. And you can see in this photo, if you look around the sides, you'll see all of these experimental lockers that have different types of experiments. And for example, in this mission, we grew wheat, we grew mushrooms, we had mice that we used to see how microgravity would affect living systems. We had furnaces to create new materials on orbit. We even had a telescope that we used to look deeper into the Milky Way, because we're flying about 250 miles above the Earth, so we're above the atmosphere, so we get clearer views of the world around us. And so all of those roles I enjoyed thoroughly. We, as we're in orbit, there's a lot of things that happen to the human body. We lose 1% of bone per month. So the longer we stay up, the more issues we have in bone loss. We lose about 10 to 15% of our muscle mass. And so you can see in this slide how thin his legs look. And that's because we don't use our anti-gravity muscles in space, because we float everywhere. And around here, of course, we're walking. So as a consequence, and I just named just a few things that happen to you, we call it space adaptation syndrome. There are a whole host of other things that happen. But one of the ways in which we can work against that is with exercise. So you see the crew member here is on a bicycle ergometer, of course, without the wheels, and simply wears a harness around the waist connected to the ergometer machine, and basically can just rotate, very effortlessly in the air there. We also have a treadmill, and here is one of our crew members on the treadmill. Again, you have to put on an harness to anchor yourself down to the tread of the treadmill, and you crank it down to near your body weight, and you run on this. And just a quick story. One of my mentors is an astronaut that came in before I did. His name is Story Musgrave. Story was bald, kind of like I am now. And Story decided that he was going to run around the world. Well, I mentioned to you the speed in which we must obtain to stay in orbit around the Earth, the 17,500 miles an hour. But I didn't tell you that it only takes 90 minutes to go completely around the world. So essentially, all he had to do was to run for 90 minutes, and he would accomplish his goal there. And that's exactly what he did. Well, as many of you may know, some of you who are involved in science, when we are exercising, we lose most of our heat from the tops of our head. And normally, this is where the sweating begins. And so as he began to run, he got into about 45 minutes or so, he started developing beads of sweat, which got greater and greater and greater, and they coalesced on the top of his head. So if we were to take a picture of him running, from the side as he's running like this, the funniest thing, we have it on video, is that he ended up with about a half an inch or so of water on the top of his head. And as he moved, the water went back and forth like a clear afro. It was pretty funny. I'll have to get the video and show that to folks sometime. We have an opportunity as astronauts to take a look at the Earth and take some wonderful pictures. And this is a photo of a thunderstorm from space. And it happens to be at night. And of course, it at night is relative in space because we get day and night every 45 minutes. So this is nighttime looking down on a thunderstorm. On my first mission, we passed over this volcano as it was erupting. And I don't know about you, but just looking down, it seems even menacing, even from 250 miles from the Earth. So I'm going to pause here and I'll let you take a look at this slide and just sort of guess where you think this is. And I know that you're looking at the desert on the left and you're looking how green it is on the right. But right in the middle are two objects that's pretty famous, and those are the pyramids. So this is Cairo in Egypt. And so two things here from a guy that loves the earth and loves ecology is that the water from the Nile has allowed them to create lush fields in the upward right part of this slide out of the desert, which would normally be to the left. Here is a dust storm from space, and you can see that dust leaving the Sahara Desert, hitting some of the islands just off the coast there, and that dust will travel as high as 50,000 feet above the Earth. And this is daytime and nighttime at the same time. This is the terminator. This is where the Earth, as we go around the sun, begins to demarcate night and day. And so you can see at the bottom of the slide is Africa. You can see Spain, you can see England, and then the rest of Europe there. Beautiful sights in orbit. But I think the most beautiful sight for me was Aurora Borealis, or Northern Lights. And this is a photo that I took as we were leaving the coast of Japan and heading toward Alaska and Canada. We were in a high inclination orbit, and so you can see this is taken before we got in. Within about probably 3 or 4 minutes, even though this is hundreds of miles away, we were in the midst of this beautiful greenish cloud. I showed you the EVA picture earlier, extravehicular activity. This is us outside of the vehicle, getting ready to deploy a satellite. And we had a wonderful time, spent about 6 hours outside. And then one of the objectives of this mission was to go to the Russian space station. So you'll see a photo that I took on the left. I actually took both of these because I was in charge of doing a photo survey of the outside of the vehicle. And this is way before we had the International Space Station, which I'll show you in a minute. But on the left is a picture of the guy who has spent, or human being, I should say, who has spent the most time in space, and that's Dr. Polyakov. At the time in which we visited him, he was about 350 days into a 422-day mission. And so to this day, he still holds the record for the longest time in space. So here's the International Space Station that I was just sharing with you. It looks like it's much smaller than the Russian space station, but it's not. Let me see if I can go back. If I go back and you look to the right here, the Russian station, with all of its arrays and solar panels, was probably about the size of half a football field. And when I switched to show you the International Space Station, that, in comparison to the Mir station, this is about 2 football fields in length and width, where we have numerous modules that are there for the 5 to 7 and occasionally up to 8 member crew who are there 365 days a year. And I always like, when I show this slide and show the International Space Station, to remind you, especially as educators, that you're educating young people now who will not know or will never know of anyone who has not been in space. So let me say that differently. Going forward, for human civilization, there will never be a time that will not be humans in space. And the space station is just the beginning. So I mentioned we travel at 17,500 miles an hour. I told you that one of my favorite views was the Aurora Borealis, but one of my other favorite views is the sunrise from on orbit. And so I sequenced these slides to show you that sunrise. So it starts at the horizon, and within a few seconds, in fact, the time that it took me to describe the sequence of these slides is how long it takes daytime to appear, and then you can apply it, into nighttime, disappearing, sunset, sunrise, and sunsets in those few seconds. And in the sunrise, the temperature will start at, on orbit, minus 165 degrees to 200 degrees within a matter of minutes. And you might say, how do you know that it's actually 160 or minus 165 degrees? And I would tell you, I know because I was on a mission where we did the first in-flight measurement of temperature in space. So we actually had a special thermometer in order to make that. So this is where I transition to talk about my view and the effort of going into space, the realization that all the things that I got a chance to accomplish to get into space, and also the things that I've gotten to participate here on Earth, really stemmed around education. My education allowed me to be able to see our wonderful planet from space and be reminded how brittle it is and how important it is. And at the same time, be able to come back down here to the Earth to share with students all across the country that experience as a means in which to get their attention and underscore the importance of education, and not just education, but STEM education in particular. And I always keep in mind this question, and that is, are our students prepared for the future, for the now? And if I was there and we were able to take a poll, I would ask you to raise your hands to let me know if you think our students are prepared. So I get a chance to answer it for you today, and that is no. I don't think that they are, and I think that in some communities it may be great and they're ready to go, but many communities in this country, our students are not prepared for that future. And just to underscore what that future holds and how important your job is as educators is not only the International Space Station, it's another view here of that station, but in space, we're going to go to the moon. The program has already been announced. It's called Artemis, and the time has been set for sometime in the late 2020s. So somewhere around 2025, 2027, somewhere in that time frame, we'll be heading back to the moon, probably with robotic vehicles and then later with human beings. And so my dream of being one of those astronauts walking on the surface of the moon will have to be taken over by some of the young people that you're involved in right now. That will set the stage for us going to Mars, which is a 3-year trip right now. But by the time some of the students that you are teaching will get out of college and perhaps go and work for NASA or some commercial company, space company, we could possibly get there in less than 3 months. So imagine that, being able to go all of those millions of miles in just 3 months. So Mars is going to be our next frontier. So how are we going to get there? Well, through these new commercial vehicles. If you've watched what's happening in the space program, you realize that we no longer just have governments that are involved in the space program, but now private companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX, and Sierra Nevada, Boeing. All of these are companies that are now building vehicles to take men and women up to the International Space Station. And then even Elon Musk with the SpaceX has announced that he's actually planning to go to the moon and Mars. I don't know if you got a chance about a month and a half ago to see the liftoff of the first commercial vehicle with 2 NASA astronauts, but it was phenomenal. It was incredible. It's a lot different way into space and to orbit than the Space Shuttle, but I thought it was more glamorous. It was incredible. And the guys did a wonderful job. They should be coming back soon. And that was a test flight. And we will be sending the first official flight in August or September. And I've got a couple of friends that are going to be on that mission. So that's what's happening in space. What's happening here on Earth? A lot of technology. With the height of it being the technology that we're using right now, the Zoom technology, that allows us in these days of COVID to be at home and being and taking this course, being to have this conversation. I've done a lot of Zoom conversations, and I'm sure that you have too. But we're changing big time. Technology is driving all the things that you have on here, from artificial intelligence to quantum computing, which is going to be the mainstay of computing in the next few years. Cognitive learning, processing, all of these things are just the things that I can name. You can bring another scientist or engineer in here and probably have a whole list of other things that are really changing the face of how we function as Earthlings here on this planet. To sort of underscore what I'm talking about, the value of STEM education. Many of you might have seen a seminal paper that was done many years ago, looking at U.S. economic competitiveness. And essentially, I mean, the first statement says it all, that the U.S. economic competitiveness rests on improving performance in math and science education. It is key to innovation. It is key to our ability to compete. It is key to driving our workforce, and our kids have to perform better.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that presentation, and I'd like to invite you to join me at the National Math and Science Initiative at nms.org, where you can follow my new mission, my new terrestrial mission, promoting math and science throughout this country. Take care.